We have a guest speaker that's joining us tonight, and I'm going to let Greg share his message with you, but ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce to you Mr. Greg Van Gorsen. Now, Greg is here with us to share with us how he's used so many lessons. Seriously, this man is quite amazing. But he has learned from his own life and how he's used those lessons to therefore change the lives of many other people. A keen mental health advocate. Can we please welcome Greg Van Gorsen?
Well, what a wonderful, wonderful crowd tonight. Thank you so much for allowing me to be here and to share some of my story with you. I'd like to normally use a stage, but we're very limited in stage space tonight, so I'll stand here and talk to you. My grandmother once said to me that you've got to live your life very much like flying an aeroplane. She goes, you've got to go for something, and it's not until you feel that engine rev that you feel the rush. It's not until you go for a big goal that you start finding the turbulence that comes from the outside world and sometimes the inside world. It's not until you reach that high altitude that things smooth out for you. But you've got to plan your landings. You've got to plan your life and plan how you're going to come back down. Is it going to be a smooth landing and allow you to take off again? Or are you going to crash and burn? And my grandmother had vast experience. At age 19, in 1921, in a small farming paddock in Quilpie in Queensland, my grandmother stood amongst 200 people. The energy was abuzz. In front of them stood a man on the lower wing of a Scottish Avro biplane. Now this man was looking for anybody, anyone that would fly with him. For 3 weeks' pay, you could have a 15-minute flight with this man. No one had the courage to step forward. The men, the other ladies, nobody. But then, just one woman decided she would. This 19-year-old girl was my grandmother. She strapped on the goggles and the leather helmet. Next thing, the engine roared to life and they took off into the sky and into aviation history. The man she flew with was a man called Hudson Fysh. And that little Scottish Avro biplane, that money she gave to him went towards purchasing a second biplane and starting an airline we now know as Qantas. So when she spoke to me about living a big life, and she spoke to me, this downtrodden school kid, about living a life with ambition, it made so much sense. But on the flip side of life, I never really fitted in anywhere. This is me. I look like an innocent, wonderful young school kid. Don't let the face fool you. I was thrown out of 3 preschools by the time I was 4 and a half. By the age of 5 at kindergarten, my kindergarten teacher pulled my parents aside and said I would be the reason she quit the profession. But what happened with that is I realized the school was never going to be for me. And I started dreaming and trying to find other things for myself to fill my mindset. And I decided one day that I wanted to be a champion. I wanted to be a sportsman. I wanted to get into movies. I had all these great wild dreams that many kids have. But I wanted to see them through. Because realistically, in school, I was never cutting it. I was downtrodden. The teachers told me I would amount to nothing. When I went to high school, my principal told me I'd be prison or dead by 21. That's how bad they thought I was. But at age 13, I'd had enough. I'd had enough of being told what I wasn't going to be. I had enough of not fitting in. I had enough of no one believing in me. And I decided to change. I was a skinny kid and I was getting bullied, I was getting picked on because I was a bit of an outcast. And I thought, you know what? If I just get strong, maybe if I take up weight training, I can do something to keep the bullies away and stop them from harassing me. And so I did. I started weight training. And something happened when I walked into that gymnasium. From the moment my hands touched that steel and I started to lift, I suddenly felt like I belonged. Something seemed right. And I felt like I was home. And I got so obsessed by this training. Every day I would wag school, I'd be in the gym and I'd be lifting. About 3 weeks into training, I was very lucky. I stumbled across a magazine completely dedicated to this sport, and it was called bodybuilding. And I wanted to be this. I ran to my friend's place who I was training with at the time. And there we sat on the floor in front of his parents, just flicking through these pages. Shots of Schwarzenegger, Lou Ferrigno, the Incredible Hulk. But then I stopped on the photograph of this one man, this physique of absolute perfection. This guy called Bob Paris. He just won the US National Bodybuilding Championships. And that's what I wanted to be. So I leapt up in front of my friend's parents and said, that's what I'm going to be. I'm going to win the National Bodybuilding Championships. Of course, they looked at Bob and then looked at me. They couldn't see the correlation. My friend's mum laughed so much that she had to leave the room, get tissues, wiping her eyes. As she came back in, she said, that's either the funniest or the most stupid thing you've ever said. They literally laughed me out of their house. Now, for a kid that had had this done to him all through his life, it was a real tipping point for me. And I was crushed by this. And I thought about it, thought, you know what? I'm going to show everybody what I can do, what I can be. And I went back to the gym and I sat on the bench and I just looked at the posters and the photographs of the champions on the wall, past and present. And I thought, you know what? I'm going to be that. And I worked at it. I put everything I had into it. Every time the school clock ticked to 9 o'clock, I'd take off and I'd go train. I put everything I had into this. But I wasn't showing much result. But I kept at it. I refused to be shown that I would be nothing with my life. I finally felt I was ready. Age 16, went into my first show. Had no idea what to do. I wish someone had told me what fake tan was back then, because all the bodybuilders wore it. I didn't. I walked out on stage glowing white. People laughed at me. They laughed me almost off stage, but I kept coming back because I wanted this more than anything. This was the only time I'd felt like I belonged. And I kept coming back, and I kept chipping away at it. And then by the time I was 20, I got out on stage after a massive leg injury, and I managed to win the national championships. But I wasn't finished. The next day, I went back to my friend's place. Hadn't been there in 7 years. I knocked on the door. His mother answered. I simply handed her my trophy. I smiled and I walked away. But what it did for me was this. I realized that if I had a goal, if I had purpose, if I had something to go for, then I was happy. You see, I grew up in a very rough area. It was called Criminal Hill. That was its nickname. I lost a lot of friends. By the time I was 20, I'd lost 6 friends to suicide. It was really hard. We had a lot of violence, a lot of drugs, and not the expensive drugs the guys get now. My mates were sucking down butane tins and all kinds of stuff. Anything to escape the reality of a housing commission community, which was very rough. A lot of fighting, you know, and a lot of my friends went to prison, and quite a few of them aren't here from various other reasons too. And I didn't want to go that path. I didn't want to be that. So after I retired from bodybuilding, I thought there's more to do. But my family badgered me into being a carpenter. My family had been carpenters. They said, you've got to get a job. You've got to get a trade. And so I went and I did it. I became a carpenter. I hated it. Every minute of it, I didn't want to be one. And every day I walked on the side, I felt like I was getting further away from what I might want to be. And I had this weird thing, I wanted to be in movies. I wanted to make movies. Now, I had no idea what I was doing. I didn't own a camera, I didn't know what a screenplay was, but I had this thing, I wanted to make movies, ever since I was a kid. And so one day my friend who's in the blue long sleeve shirt in that photograph had all his tools stolen. And it was my chance. I said, you know what? Have mine, I'm gone. He said, what are you going to do? I said, I'm going to go make movies. He said, how? I said, I don't know, but I'm going to figure it out. And off I went. 15 years it took. But you know what? I chipped away at it, and I chipped away at it, and I didn't make it. But I didn't give up because it was the only time I felt like I mattered. So I kept on going, and I ended up going to Hong Kong and starting to make my name there, and I came back and eventually broke into the industry. And I managed to direct some of the big films. My directing partner and dear friend, Dr. George Miller, and I have done some major films together, from the Happy Feet to the new Mad Max Fury Road film. I choreographed all the fight action on Mad Max. Mad Max was intense, and it was a journey. But most of you don't know the truth of what happened on that film. We'd moved to Africa. The whole family, my whole family, a wonderful wife there and my kiddies came across to Africa with me, and we lived in the desert for a year making that movie. But we went massively over time and massively over budget, and the studio came in and they shut us down. We had everything in this film. Every bit of effort, every bit of blood and sweat I'd ever put into anything, I'd put into this movie. And in one stroke of the pen, it was over. It was 17 years of work from my life had gone into making this film happen, and it was gone. And we came home to Australia on my birthday with nothing. And any money we had saved wasn't there much longer either, because I got hit with a massive tax bill because they'd done the wrong taxation amounts. We were literally broke. It was January, my birthday, and I'm ringing friends trying to figure out what we can do for work. I needed to keep making money. We still had a house to pay. It was January, there was nothing open, no work, no films. So eventually I managed to get onto a friend, and I ended up going back into the trade as a labourer on a massive construction site. It was devastating to me. The one thing I never wanted to be was back there. For 17 years, I put every ounce of my sweat into becoming something that I could be at least happy about in my life. Goal-driven, to escape all the pain that happened in my community. And I went for it, I gave it everything, and it was gone in one day. And I still remember very vividly the first moment my steel cap boots touched the mud. I just looked to the sky and wondered what the hell had happened to my life. But I did it because of the kids, the wife, the family, the house. We had to keep making money. And I kept doing it. A year later, I was still there. And I was in a real dark place. It's amazing what happens when you're suffering and you're a man. Because we don't talk. Shit, we weren't even asked for directions. You know? And I just got darker and darker and darker and lower and more introverted. I became a bad father. I was neglecting the kids. I was becoming a bad husband because I didn't want to talk to my wife. I was doing 10 hours a day down the bottom of a lift shaft, knee deep in mud with a shovel, scraping mud off sheep piles. I felt degraded, I felt ashamed, and I felt like I'd let everybody down. My next birthday, I was hanging on by a very, very thin thread. I sat on the bed and I looked at my kids before I went into work. And I kissed them goodbye, not knowing I'd come home again. I thought this was the day, my birthday, that I was going to end this. I didn't know if I was going to come back. My little boy looked up at me, he opened his eyes for that moment and said, "I love you, Daddy." And I thought to myself, you know what? I've got to fight for these kids. I've got to fight for this life. I decided I had to fight to come back. I went onto the site that morning, a little bit late. One of my friends, Benny, and a colleague of mine, walked past me. We didn't know he was in trouble. No one knew who was struggling. I was hanging on by such a thin thread, I couldn't even tell. We all wore gas masks and it was a high toxic site. We couldn't see people's faces. He walked past me up all the stairs, and 5 minutes later was lying next to me, having taken his own life. It was devastating. So many people witnessed this. So many people's lives were ripped apart in that one moment. When I finished my interview with the police, they corralled all the workers up into this room, and they left them there while they tried to source help because it was such a devastating event. And I don't know what came over me. I just looked at all these big, tough, strong blokes just sitting there looking into space, not knowing what to say. Not one of them could say a word. And I've been through 11 suicides in my life. 11. And I'd had enough. Now, they didn't know how close to the edge I was hanging on by a thread. But I just stood up and I said, you know what, guys? We've got to change this. And we have to start by talking. If we think we're tough, we're not tough until we can speak about our issues, until we can tell the world that we've got troubles, until we can put our hand up and say to a friend that, you know what, we're struggling, help me. I said, if anybody else in this room is feeling the same way, you come and see me when I'm finished and I will walk you to help myself. When I finished speaking, 6 guys stayed behind. And we walked them to help, and they're still with us today. But what it did for me was this. It was an awakening moment for me. In that one moment where I felt there was nothing left in my life, it had been turned around by speaking and saving and helping and letting people know that there's more hope out there. And I decided to fight back. And I put everything into this. I decided to write a book for my kids called From Daddy. It's just a book I wrote to my kids only. It's just a book of life lessons that if they ever need it, if I'm ever not there, they've got something to look for. All the answers are in there for them that I can give them from my life of winning and losing and coming back. We managed to fight to get our film back on track. Eventually we got it out there and it did well. But I made a conscious decision that day to walk away from making movies. I made a conscious decision to start helping people realize that there's always a way back. You see, the thing about suicide prevention, it's still a very taboo subject, but we always talk in terms of numbers. You can tell me there's 20 million people dying. It doesn't make as much difference as it could if we just do this, and I want you to all do this. Look at the people now on your table. Look at them. Look at everybody. Look at me in the eye. And do it now. This is what I want you to do. Look at everyone. If you know them, think of the experiences you've had, the times you've spent together, if you've just met them, the laughs you might have had tonight. Think of it. Everybody close your eyes. And imagine that tomorrow none of us are here. The time we start putting faces to names is the time we'll start making a massive change. Because every life lost isn't a number, it's a person. It's a human being, it's a life, it's someone we need to fight for. We need to give them reason, we need to give them purpose, we need to give them something to live for. But to do that, we have to look for the signs. If your friends are struggling, ask them. Don't just say hello and walk off, say, how are you going? And if they say not so good, listen for the answer. Ask them the next question. Keep the conversation going and don't be afraid to ask. If someone is struggling and they're down, reach them and help them up. Be prepared to take the extra step. Be prepared to listen. If we do that, we're already starting the conversation that we need to keep going, and we're already moving forward in a positive direction. And we will save so many more lives by doing that. Because every life matters. Everyone in this room is part of a giant extended family. Even just by being here, you're part of this team. And we need to look out for our teams. We need to look out for our people because they matter. To me, life, I love life. I embrace every day I'm above ground. You know, I nearly died in January this year training to have a crack at summiting Everest. I nearly died of a stroke. And then met up with Bromwell 2 days later when I got out of the stroke ward in the hospital to do a mental health workshop. But it was worth it. You know why I got on that plane? You know why I went up? Because any chance it is that I have to help myself, help someone, help save, help someone else grow, help someone see there's a way back, that the end isn't this, that there's always potential to come back. That's a wonderful journey for me, and I love being on this. I love the work everyone here is doing. The purpose we have and what we're standing for and what we're fighting for matters. And if you realize that, then we're going to be in a good place in a couple of years' time, because it's only going to get better, and we're going to reduce the amount of suicides in this world. So from me to you, remember this. No matter how bad life gets, no matter how dark your world gets, keep hope, because you're not alone, and there's always a way back. So thank you very much.